Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of Talk Show with RJ Sheedy. I'm your host, TV's RJ Sheedy. Joining us now in studio is Congressman Joe Kennedy. Congressman, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here today.
Thanks for having me.
I have a lot to talk to you about.
Great.
You are a Massachusetts politician with the name Kennedy. I don't even want to ask about your name and what it means to be a Kennedy in the family legacy. You have that question all the time. Also, I'm going to do you one more. I'm not going to ask you about running for president in 2020. You're not running. Unless I get a wink now that you are, you're not running.
Nope.
Okay,
No wink,
fantastic.
none. There you
so
go.
we got those two out of the way already. But I do want to talk about your family a little bit. I want to ask you about your dad.
Mm-hmm.
Is it true that your dad didn't want you to run for Congress at first?
Yeah, so I think a lot of folks expect that because I've had other family members that were in public office, that expect that, as some people frame it, it's a family business and that people are going to go into it. I think if you have ever run for office or you have an idea as to what it entails, you understand it's a different dynamic, it's a different field, it's a different business. And my dad basically pulled me aside when I was debating whether to run for this or not, for Congressman Frank's seat back in 2012. I was about to get engaged. My then girlfriend, now wife, had kind of plans moving in one direction, and this was a big reconfiguration for us. And he wanted to make sure I was ready for. And he pushed me pretty hard not to do it, because unless there's a real kind of burning and abiding reason why you do want to, people can tell. And then it's miserable because you don't really want to be there. Particularly a first campaign, it's hard, it's rigorous, there's never a day off. You are up early, you're home late, and it demands an awful lot of commitment, not just from a candidate, but from their family and friends and everything around you, because you basically, your world shrinks to basically run this race. And if I wasn't up for it, then don't do it. And so he pushed me pretty hard not to. And then when I was certain that it's something I wanted to do, and he knew that, he was behind me every step of the way. So it was good advice. And
you're obviously doing really well. You were lucky enough to give the response to the State of the Union address.
Right.
What's that face? You gave a good speech. You got rave reviews.
Thank you.
Do you want to talk about what the message of that speech was?
So the speech itself, look, I was honored to be asked by our leadership to give the speech. It's a speech that, it's a difficult spot, right? You're no one, myself included, is ever going to match the kind of environment of the President of the United States addressing the House, the Senate, the diplomatic corps, the Supreme Court, what that State of the Union response is, or what the State of the Union is. So it's a tough speech to give. I was honored to be selected, a bit daunted by the task. Glad to know you thought it went all right. I think it went fine. It turns out we live in a very kind and gracious and generous country. I have gotten tubes of chapstick from every corner of the country sent to my office.
Oh, I got you something as well for coming here.
Thank you very much.
So a tube of chapstick and some other things for you.
Beautiful.
Take a look at that later.
Thank you. So like I said, kind, gracious, generous country. The overall message, I think, was reasonably well received. I got the criticism that you might expect from conservative colleagues and conservative media for some of the criticisms that I pointed out and critiques I pointed out for this administration. Fine. Didn't expect it to be quite as perhaps personal or vitriolic as it might have been. That being said, comes with the territory. So all in all, I think it went all right.
That's amazing. Let's switch gears a little bit now. Let's talk about some of the issues that are impacting our country. One thing that we all just watched as a nation was the Parkland school shootings that just happened. There's a giant social movement now going about this, being led by the students like David Hogg and such like that. Right now, 77% of Americans do not think Congress is doing enough to stop mass shootings. What do you think needs to happen to protect students from experiencing another school shooting and to protect the country from experiencing another mass shooting?
So, RJ, look, the country is right. We're not doing enough. I just came from another high school in our district, and probably about 100, 120 students that were there for speaking to a couple of government classes, and asked them for the top issues on their mind, and they came up with a list of about 20 or so. When I asked for them to rank those issues, gun violence was the number one issue. Almost every single student there raised their hand. I don't think it's even a debate. We're not doing enough. Congress isn't doing anything. We're hardly even talking about it. We've issued thoughts and prayers after mass shooting since I've been there, and our colleagues still refuse to actually, I think, address any sort of meaningful legislation to try to tackle that issue. Now, look, I think if we're honest about the issue, you realize that it's a complex one. There isn't one single legislative policy that's going to solve it, but there are steps that we can take. If you kind of look at the data around this, it is to make sure that young men have gotten their hands on weapons that can inflict massive amounts of damage. And I think we can ask those questions as to how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and what can we do about it. So raising the age, at bare minimum, raising the age for people to be able to get access to an assault weapon, I think is a good place to start. I support an assault weapons ban, trying to make sure that these weapons don't so easily fall into people's hands. There's other issues that, while not triggered in Parkland, but about a gun show loophole, cracking down on straw purchasers, a private sale loophole, trying to make sure that these guns aren't diverted. Background checks clearly would help, and enhanced background checks that don't quite go quite as far as I think we would like. That system itself needs to be strengthened, as we've seen. And then mental health. My Republican colleagues often like to point to mental health as a driving issue in a number of these instances. And I think, again, you got to take a step back and look at the data. There's been a couple studies comprehensive studies of mass shootings. One of them looked at 237 different incidents of mass violence and saw that mental health was an aspect in, I think, about 20% of those instances. So is it an issue? Yes. And do we need to do more there? Yes. Is that the driving concern which sparks these episodes of violence? No, it's not. So we can do both. One, we got to crack down on the availability and accessibility of these guns. Two, I think, again, right to ask the question as to why, when these episodes seem to happen, they are young men. Three, we can invest and should invest in our mental health system. I would turn to my colleagues, though, and say, if that's the case and you believe that this is a mental health issue, then recognize the fact that you have tried to systematically dismantle and destroy the single biggest payer of mental health care in this country, which is Medicaid. Their efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act were devastating. We're going to be devastating to Medicaid. We're going to be devastating in mental and behavioral health care as they tried to strip away access to mental behavioral health care for millions of Americans. So understand that if you're going to frame this as a mental health issue, then you should be investing in that system and making reforms to make sure that everybody gets access to it, strengthening it, making sure that, particularly in schools, students get access to counselors when they need to, and that those counselors have the availability, the time, the resources to actually address the needs of their students, and not looking at a student to counselor ratio of hundreds, literally, to one. That's not access to care. And students these days are under an awful lot of pressure. Let's make sure that they get the care that they need while they're at school to be able to deal with it. And whether that's students that are being victimized by some of these environments in schools, or some of those students that are also perpetrating in some of that bullying. So there's a lot more here that we can do. I don't think we're actually, we're not coming anywhere close to addressing the core of these issues. And until we do, I think students like David and some of the other ones that we've seen are doing exactly what they should do, which is not accepting excuses or platitudes or reasons from their political leaders and moving on. These are kids that should be able to enjoy the fact that they're kids and should be able to be high school students and be middle school students and be elementary school students, as every child in this country deserves. And the idea that we're somehow walking around saying, look, this is the price of freedom, there's just nothing you can do, it's a risk that we're going to have to take, and oh yeah, we'll give you a transparent backpack so that we can make sure that, or a backpack that is, insulated with Kevlar to serve as a bulletproof vest. No, and I wholeheartedly reject that as a solution.
There is a whole lot of ideas that are going around. Maybe the clear plastic bags will work. You suggested maybe putting more counselors in school, which I do think could be a good option. One idea that is becoming a serious debate now is arming teachers. Do you think this is a good idea?
No. Look, the idea that this comes from an argument that the way you stop a bad guy with a gun was a good guy with a gun. Okay, we can unpack that for a second. There was an armed sheriff's deputy at Parkland, at the school. Obviously didn't stop it. You can try to put the blame on that individual officer, which critics have done, and without getting into the question as to whether he should have done more or operated differently. The fact is that more guns don't solve this problem. If we believe that more guns solve this problem, then we've got more guns per capita than any other country in the world. We wouldn't have this problem. It doesn't. And so I think what we need to do is to understand that there are measures that we can take to try to make sure that people don't get access to these guns and don't end up being able to target schools the way that they do. Again, background checks, I think are background checks, private sale loophole, gun show loophole can be helpful on that. An assault weapons ban can clearly be helpful on this. And then flushing out and investing in our mental and behavioral health system. Finally, and I don't think we've done enough of this too, it's asking students what they think can help in those schools. Asking students why, what reforms they're either seeing or should be talked about, or that they believe we should be focused on, and not just thinking that, because we're in Washington, we somehow think that you have access to some smart folks and can solve every one of these problems. These are kids that are in school every single day, and I think they have to be engaged in whatever solution here is going to look like. There's a whole wide variety of other options out there too that aren't quite as ready for prime time yet, but it's certainly something that I'm committed to and keep trying to plug away at.
Okay, let's switch issues a little bit now. You are a huge supporter of the LGBTQ community. When people ask you, what do you do for the community? What decisions, what votes, what do you turn to say I support you?
So, look, I think part of this is the legislative agenda in Washington and trying to be proactive, whether that's legislation that is authored, which I've done, particularly around one of the big areas of focus for a conservative right when it comes to LGBT rights has been on religious freedom, and using the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, as a way to essentially deny certain rights to essentially various minority populations because they say it's against our religion. And I've drafted a bill there that took a couple of years to draft and to try to get right, but that tries to protect religious freedom, recognizing that's an important bedrock to our society and to our country, but says that you can't use that as a way to discriminate, and tries to recalibrate that balance. So there's a legislative side. There's a bunch of votes that I've taken and cast on various issues kind of along with it. Two is advocacy. And so I'm the chair of the transgender task force in Washington, trying to make sure that our Congress at least understands how issues that a lot of folks in our communities just wouldn't think about because they're not things challenges that they confront every day, but do affect various segments of our population, particularly obviously our trans community, get brought up and get discussed in Congress so people can understand, hey, this isn't something that you might not come to face with on a daily basis, but this is how it impacts other folks. And we've been really active around President Trump's announcement of his intent to try to ban transgender soldiers from the military.
Yeah, that just came from a tweet. Do you at all get frustrated when the president tries and makes policy on Twitter and stuff like that?
Yeah. Look, it's not, people can get frustrated with Washington, and for good reason. It doesn't move quickly, it sometimes moves too slowly, and it's oftentimes inadequate to address everybody's concerns. I hear that. There's also a reason for why it is slow and at best deliberative and sometimes just too slow. But it's trying to make sure that you go through and are thoughtful about the policies that come forward. Think of what this means if you are, and there's several thousand members of the trans community serving in our military today. So think of what that announcement over Twitter meant if you were a member of our military and it happened to be a member of the trans community serving in Korea or Afghanistan or Iraq or some base overseas, or you had a child who actually was a member of a trans community, where you had your commander-in-chief all of a sudden sit there and say, we don't want you wearing a uniform anymore. We're not going to protect your child. We're not going to protect your family. Do you show up for work? Do you come home? Where do you go? What do you do? And it wasn't just me, it wasn't just members of our task force that were so upset about this. You talked to a number of pretty conservative colleagues about this too, and they were stunned. As one of them said to me, how do you tell a current member of the military that you can't wear the uniform anymore? Somebody who is serving and serving honorably with no issue, how do you tell them, no, we're going to take it away from you? You don't. You can't. We don't do that in our country. And there's colleagues of mine that have certain challenges and issues with certain aspects of the allocation of taxpayer dollars for gender reassignment surgery. Fine, we can have that discussion and debate. I come down on it very differently than they will. But even those folks were saying, look, this isn't about that. This is about how do you support a military. And we've heard now from the commanders from the Navy, the Army, the Air Force that have asked if were asked, I think a week or so ago, in congressional testimony, if they've heard of any single issue about unit cohesion or troop readiness because of trans members serving the military, and every single one of them said no. So I think it's based on bad policy. I think I know it's based on bad policy. It's bad politics. It's not reflective of our values, and it's a attempt at a what I think the president would term a solution in search of a problem. It's addressing something that actually isn't an issue. Let our troops serve, let our military be the greatest military in the world, and support them. And I wish the president would. Unfortunately, with this issue, I don't believe he is.
Okay, I agree. Now, to bring things back to home in Massachusetts for a moment, there's a ballot question that we're voting on in November titled the Massachusetts Gender Identity Anti-Discrimination Vote Referendum. That's basically a bill to prohibit discrimination based on gender identity in public places such as hotels, bars, restaurants, where you have it. Similarly, my state senator, Ryan Fatmans, voted against a Senate bill, S736, titled Prohibition Discrimination Based on Gender Identity. Just like a no vote would in November, it's basically a vote against equal protection for vulnerable citizens. Clearly, this is not just a Senator Fatman issue. There are many lawmakers across the country, even I'm sure people who you work with in the Congress, that are against things like this. What do you say to senators and representatives and congressmen like this who vote against what are arguably civil rights issues?
So I don't think they're arguably civil rights issues. They are civil rights issues.
Okay, that's a good point to make. They are civil rights issues.
Look, the basic promise of this country, period, is that everybody's treated equally, right? It's actually etched in stone on the Supreme Court, equal justice under law, right? And our history is a story where we have fallen short of that promise literally from our founding day, right? We said all men are created equal, and we meant rich Protestant white men, and that was it. And we've evolved over time to say that when we say all men, we actually mean women too. We mean African Americans. They weren't initially counted as people, and then they were 3/5 of a person, and now they're everybody, right? A full person. But we recognize in our society that this is the promise of becoming a more perfect union, recognizing you're never going to be perfect, but you fight along the way, and you do what you can every single day, each generation, to try to actually reach that goal. And so when you see those words etched in stone in the Supreme Court, when you recognize the fact that we have treated people differently because of who they are, and we learn in school, you learn through the experience in our lives, that if the country founded on literally the idea of freedom doesn't allow its people to actually be free to be who they are, then a lot of those other guarantees of freedom fall away pretty quickly. If your government is saying you cannot be you, man, that's a pretty dangerous place to start. And so I look at these very clearly as civil rights issues, and I look at them and say all that this is about is trying to say that everybody else in this room, everybody else on TV gets the same rights that I do. And the fact of the matter is that today in our country, they don't, right? And I think we can do better than that. And this Massachusetts was able to catch up to, I think at the time it was 13 other states that already had these protections in place. Massachusetts was able to catch up to them and codify these protections, again, to make sure that everybody across our society is just treated equally.
A lot of people in the country kind of look at Massachusetts as like a leader for LGBTQ rights, passing, legalizing gay marriage under a Republican governor. That's something that I'm very proud of. Why do you think a law, something along these lines, hasn't yet been passed at a state level?
Well, so the law here was, and so it was passed. It was passed, and this is an initiative, a ballot initiative, to actually pull back to pull back the protections that were codified in place.
Wait, so this whole ballot in November is about voting no for these citizens?
So Massachusetts a couple of years ago we didn't have these protections in place. The law got passed. It was a big debate on Beacon Hill. John Fernandez, your former state representative here, led that effort and was a big reason why the law ended up getting passed and signed into law from a Democratic legislature and by Charlie Baker, Republican governor. And those protections were then codified. What this is an effort to do is to roll back those protections that are now law. And it's a ballot initiative to try to engage in basically scare tactics to say that the protections that are in place at the moment have created a danger to our society. And they point to no data because there is none. And it's just an effort to roll back the protections that were far too slow in coming. But now that they're here, people are protected, and it's an effort to try to take those protections away.
Well, that's definitely something that I was not aware of, and I'm thankful that you are here being a vocal supporter of this issue of voting for yes on this thing in November. Let's move things a little.
You want to vote aye. We'll be voting. The ballot initiative is to repeal the protections. So
I want to vote no?
Yes.
Oh, this is so stupid. Okay, I feel like I just had this debate about another Milford issue. Yes means yes, no means no. All right, let's move on a little bit now. There are two different wings of the Democratic Party kind of happening right now. There's the regular Democratic Party, and I guess there's like the progressive unit of the party where like Bernie Sanders and people like that fall into. Two things that like people who are more progressives advocate for is something along the lines of single-payer health care and potentially legalizing marijuana. What are your stance on those issues?
So single-payer health care, absolutely the direction we need to go in. I think what we've seen with health care is that it's complicated and the details matter, and I think we need to be thoughtful about how we get there. So a couple of principles behind this. One, every single person in this country deserves access to quality, affordable, accessible health care, period. That isn't, at least in my mind, within the Democratic Party, isn't up for debate. The debate is about, okay, how do we actually get there? There's a number of different proposals that are out there. Some move more aggressively than others. But that's actually where the debate, I think, should be. There's a bill out there that a lot of folks in the House and advocates are focused on. I think if you do a detailed reading of that bill, it actually potentially has a detrimental impact on the district that I represent. So I'm wholeheartedly with you in spirit and in principle.
It's just something that we got to move more towards.
No, it means that the details matter. And in healthcare, the details are complicated, and because it ends up being very, very personal. So, for instance, that specific bill could mean the closure of the hospital in Taunton, Massachusetts, which is a critical access point for care for residents of Taunton. It is silent on what an alternative would look like, or where they should go for care, what it could look, what alternatives they would have. Before I'm going to sit there and sign my name onto a bill that is going to mean the closure of a critically important facility for healthcare access for thousands of the constituents I have, I want to know what an alternative is. This doesn't say what that is. There's a number of other issues that I have with the individual proposals of that bill, and what that means as you try to translate it down to policy. It doesn't mean that I'm not for the overall principle. It means that I want to make sure we have those details worked out before you sit there and say, this is the direction we need to go in. And so, again, the effort that bill seeks to codify is the idea that every single person in this country deserves quality, accessible, affordable health care. There is no debate on that in my mind. You contrast that with some of our Republican colleagues who basically say, look, that's fine, but we don't want the federal government to pay for it. My response is, you're paying for it anyway. You just don't know that you're paying for it. You're paying for it in tax dollars, you're paying for it in increased premiums, you're paying for it in the different aspects of how we actually finance healthcare. Let's actually make this a clear alignment, and then use the money that we have to drive down the cost of care so you actually pay less. That debate has gotten distorted far more than it should have been. But that's where the discussion needs to go, is on costs in healthcare, not on this debate of coverage.
Okay. What about legal weed? Massachusetts have already said yes to it.
Yes, Massachusetts has. And so this is one this is a hard one for me. I struggle with this one personally a bit. Democratic Party, and certainly for a younger generation, they're moving pretty hard towards legalization. I think we just need to be thoughtful about it. And I think that you've got states like Massachusetts that I think have put in place a thoughtful regulatory scheme to try to make sure that this doesn't get diverted or end up in kind of unintended consequences. However, I've spent an awful lot of time focusing in Washington on mental behavioral health and addiction. And when you talk to professionals in an addiction community, they will point to the challenges that marijuana can represent, particularly for young adults, and what the impact that can have. And I think we need to be thoughtful about if we are going to legalize it. And clearly, again, Massachusetts voters have spoken on this. I want to make sure that we have the right consumer protections and safeguards put in place. And I don't think we wholly do. That being said, Massachusetts voters have spoken, and I respect their voice.
Fantastic, fantastic. You are up for re-election this November. For some reason, midterms are always historically a low turnout for Democrats. How do we get people out to the polls and voting, not only here in Milford, in Massachusetts, but across the whole country?
Look, it's a challenge of every election. You got to make these policies and what's at stake personal. And I think what we've seen largely from groups, particularly these students from Parkland, is that people feel they feel the impacts of this election very personally. This past election, and I think they recognize that they've got a chance to send a message to their federal government that the direction in which we are moving is not necessarily one that they support. Now, look, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're against everything that the current administration does, or you're going to be for everything a Democratic House of Representatives or Democratic Senate would do. President Trump is still going to be president of the United States come December, November, December of 2018. He's not up for re-election. But what this is an opportunity for people to say, if you voted for Donald Trump to send a message, to understand whether that message has been received and to see whether, in fact, you've got a government in Washington that is listening to you or not. And I point out to my Republican colleagues that for all of the rhetoric about saying they're being responsive to the needs of the message that was sent in November of 2016, if you believe that, then justify for me that in the special elections that we've seen from Kansas to Montana to Georgia to Arizona a couple weeks ago, and Alabama, why Democrats have closed the margins in some of the most conservative races in the country by 15 to 20 points in almost every single one. If you are doing such a good job, why is the president's approval rating still in the low 40s? If you're doing such a good job, why is there such angst and anxiety that citizens feel across the country? And understanding that you might not represent, for my Republican colleagues in Mississippi and Arkansas, they might not represent folks from Massachusetts and say, look, that's not my issue. On the one hand, fair. On the other hand, those voices are voices of Americans too, and they're your countrymen too. And I think what you're seeing is a reflection of the fact that we've got unified Republican control of government in Washington, but you've got one where Republicans won the House of Representatives by a considerable number of seats, but a pretty small number of votes, about 2 million votes, but about 50-seat majority. You've got a 49-51 split in the U.S. Senate, literally as close as it can get. And you've got a president that clearly won an election, but lost a popular vote. So you've actually got a country that's pretty evenly divided, but you've got a governance coming out of Washington that ends up being very conservative oriented. And so you've got people saying, hey, I might have voted a certain way, but I didn't want you to then go say, hey, we're going to vote Republican and then govern from an extreme right. We wanted to govern from a center right. And what you've got is a governance from an extreme, and so you're seeing a populist backlash against that governing philosophy. Moderate. Listen to those voices. Deal with Democrats, right? We represent people too. Our voices count too. So far, most of my colleagues have not been willing to do that on those big issues: healthcare, taxes, immigration, and the country wants us to. And I think they've still got a shot to, or a chance to actually engage us in those discussions on moving this ball forward on gun violence, meaningful gun violence legislation. But if they don't, you can't say that they weren't, that there weren't warning signs. You can't say that people weren't raising their voices, telling them to do so. They were just ignored. And when you ignore, as a government, if you ignore the voices of your people, you're right to face the consequences.
All right, so we're almost out of time. I do want to ask you one more question. During the interview, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about LGBTQ rights. We talked about gun violence. We talked about the Trump on Twitter. We talked about a whole lot of things. Milford's a small town. I think the whole town might be here today. Why should voters send you back to Washington on their behalf this November?
Thanks, RJ. Look.
Don't worry, I'm voting for you. I'm not asking for me.
No. Well, thank you. But I appreciate the question. Look, I ran for office 5 years ago, in 2012, 6 years ago now, on the idea that I think that the promise our government makes for people is that you get a shot. You get a real shot. You get a fair shot to make the most out of your talent, your hard work, and the skills that you have. And I've been working really hard every day to try to make good on that promise. We've made some progress on it. We've obviously got an awfully long way to go. And I think some of the policies that have been recently enacted make that harder, not easier. But my commitment to my constituents here in Milford and across the 4th District is to go out there every single day and try to earn your trust, your respect, your support. I recognize that people won't agree with me on every single issue, and I appreciate that. My job is to be informed and knowledgeable, and to treat every person that I come across with the respect that I would want to be dealt with if I had questions about my government, and to try to help. And I believe that government can be a force for good in people's lives, and I believe we can make a difference, but I believe you got to throw yourself at it with all you got. And I've tried to, and I hope to keep doing it.
Congressman Kennedy, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to be here at Milford TV. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for today. Congressman Kennedy's got to go off on his busy day. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
This was
well
amazing.
done.